Shalom, and welcome to a message for the Parsha for Parshat Balak. Towards the end of the Parsha, perhaps the last episode of the Parsha, very tragic one, in which the people of Midian and Moab orchestrated a plan by the advice of Bilam, the non-Jewish prophet who had it out for the Jews, who wanted them destroyed, who first tried to curse them, but was forced, through Hashem, he was forced to bless the Jews. In fact, he gave us some of the greatest blessings. So he advised them to get the Jews to sin. And by getting them to sin through doing acts that are totally immoral and would absolutely upset the Almighty, and then have them worship idols, that, he said, would guarantee them the demise of the Jews, because God himself will punish them. In other words, they will destruct from within. And so they did. They got the daughters of Moab and Midian, to seduce the Jewish people, the weak ones of them, and after they were seduced, they got them to worship their idol. Now, what was the idol? The Torah tells us it's called Baal Peor. What is this Baal Peor? Peor really means, literally, the word Peor means to reveal, to uncover something. What kind of worship was it? It was a specific type of idolatry. Well, the sages explain, and Rashi even quotes it, that this idolatry, the service of it, called for literally revealing what? Revealing one's backside in front of it and defecating. And it sounds ridiculous. It sounds crazy. It sounds absolutely insane. But that was their form of worship for this particular idol. Very crazy and ridiculous one. The Hasidic teachings give us an insight into the idea. What is behind this? In other words, what does this mean? And more importantly, perhaps the most important point, how does this relate to our lives? In other words, none of us would catch ourselves doing something so ridiculous and absurd as to defecate to something as a form of worship. So Hasidus explains that all the worldly pleasures that we know, all the indulgences in this world, like everything in this world, has a source in Kedusha, in the higher realms of spirituality and holiness. And therefore, if we look for the source, the actual origin, in the purest and holiest places, we will know, we will find out, that what is the origin, what is the source of worldly pleasures? The true and ultimate and pure pleasures, which is the spiritual pleasures, that pleasure of getting close to God, the pureness and the adorability of the greatness of godliness and so on. That is what really pleasure is meant to be. However, after many descents, so to speak, after many deviations and variations, it could actually end up being something as plain, coarse, worldly pleasures. So in other words, it's the waste, it's the trash of the true and correct and real lofty pleasures that ends up being the worldly mundane pleasures that we know of. Thus, when one attributes too much importance to worldly things, when one gives too much attention to worldly pleasures, and worse over, if someone starts to indulge in it to the degree where one becomes totally consumed with it, that is in a sense worshiping the idol of Peor. Because what you're worshiping is something which is in a certain sense, in a spiritual sense, a form of defecation. Because it's trash, it's the waste, and that's what ends up being that. So that is a very important lesson for us. Although, of course, like I said, none of us would actually go out there and worship an idol, let alone an idol with such ridiculous type of service. However, in a spiritual sense, in a lofty sense, In a figurative, metaphoric sense, so sadly, many of us end up at some point or another having some kind of worship, some kind of form of paying some kind of attention, if I may, to something which may be of idealistic in nature, meaning it may have some, at least remote resemblance or of the idea of what the idolatry was all about. So it's important, of course, to be sure, it's important to have a comfortable life, and it's important to enjoy in the correct manner, to enjoy those things that Hashem wants us to enjoy, so we can have a comfortable life, so our minds can be peaceful, so we can serve Hashem, and we can be kind and nice to others. It's obvious when one is in discomfort, one is not able to function, but not to worship it as a means in itself, as a purpose in itself, that is, and not to worship the indulgences and the pleasures of this world as a means of, in itself, as a purpose in itself, that is. Rather, it should be as a means to reach higher goals. So obviously, when one feels rested, or one feels comfortable, one is well fed, one could now serve Hashem, one can now pray, one can now study Torah, one can now go out there and do charity properly, and be kind to others, and be merciful, because they're in a good place. That is why we have all those things, but not as a purpose in itself. May we always have an abundance and of access and availability of all the good things that there are in this world, but not as a purpose in themselves, rather that we should always utilize it for the right purpose of serving Hashem and being kind to mankind. Shabbat Shalom.